Hello YouTube. Welcome to the T-34 Shock, the Soviet Legend in Pictures live stream. Now before we get on with proceedings, we would just like to say that thank you for being here. It means a lot that you are here watching us today. We are not professionals when it comes to live streaming, so if something seems a bit janky, don't worry. We'll get through it. I think this is going to be a laugh. I think we're going to have a lot. We're going to have a good time discussing this T-34 book. So we'll start off with introductions then, and I'll go first as I'm already talking. So unless you don't know, my name is Francis Pulham. I am a military historian. My first book, Fallen Giants, which I have in front of me right here, came out in 2017. I've been writing for military history websites like Tanks Encyclopedia now for about 5 years. I don't produce very many articles, but I like to think that they're very good quality. And yeah, that's all I've got to say about me.
So for those who don't know me, I'm Will Kerrs. I'm the co-author of this new T-34 Shock book. I've worked for T for a little bit longer, Tanks Encyclopedia, something like 6 years now. Saw that grow from a small 3-man team to about 80 now, as a matter of fact, members. So my specialties have really been Chinese vehicles, typically the early PRC, Spanish vehicles, typically the Spanish Civil War, as well as Soviet vehicles of the Second World War. I've just finished my master's degree and I'm ready for this book to come out as soon as possible. You know, we're going to have fun.
I cannot tell you how excited I am to get this book out. I mean, it's been a long time coming. We've worked really hard, and I think that it's going to be an absolute treat for everyone when it finally comes out. Before we get on with talking about the T-34 book, let's talk a little bit about the pair of us. How did we meet?
Well, I think it was Stan Luchin who tagged me in a post about, I think, 6 years ago now. I think it was your post talking about your T-35 book, which we've shamelessly plugged once already, so let's not plug it again. And I said, oh, we need to, you know, we just hit it off, I suppose. We got talking about vehicles, obscure stuff, the Odessa tank, and we very quickly realised we were living thereabouts parallel lives. You know, I was in the cadets, you were in the air cadets. You know, you love Soviet vehicles, I love Soviet vehicles. You like metal rock music, I like real music, that kind of thing. So, you know, we parallel lives.
Yeah, it was really weird how similar we are with some subtle differences. And obviously you worked with me.
Just pull up that picture of us two together.
Oh, I'm putting some pictures on the screen for people to see who we are, and more importantly, you know, what we do. So obviously we've been working together now for 4 or so years. I invited you on to help me out with Fallen Giants, and you know, you did a fantastic job really getting the book into an actual readable state. That first version of Fallen Giants I handed you was not the best, and since then, obviously, we worked basically from scratch on this T-34 book together. I'm very proud to call you my co-author, not just editor, but we both put in a lot to this T-34 book.
Yeah, and it was a labour of love. I think the thing with Fallen Giants is it's a much smaller project, not just in terms of its scope, but obviously in terms of you know, just things like photographs as well. Far fewer in that than in this book, which I think we have around about 600 in this one. Whereas what did Fallen Giants have? 200 thereabouts.
176 images in total. So
yeah,
triple, quadruple.
Well, I mean, one of the criticisms we got with Fallen Giants was that the editing wasn't on point. And when I was doing editing with Fallen Giants, it was more thinking about direction of the book, sort of things we should put in. Whereas this one, I'm hands-on, fine-tooth comb for this book, not a comma out of place. You know, so that's That's the big difference with this one. So those of you who aren't familiar with Fallen Giants, available now. But, we're talking about the T-34 shock today. So I think the big question that everyone wants to know is, what's the book about?
Would it surprise you if I said the T-34? Because it would surprise me.
Do you know, it wouldn't. No.
So T-34 Shock is a new T-34 book which primarily focuses on the production of the T-34, and by that we're talking about how the vehicle evolved from when it was first implemented into the Red Army in 1940 all the way through Soviet production and into Polish and Czechoslovakian production, which ends in 1956. The book primarily focuses on factory level production changes. There is a small section about Soviet updates in the 1960s, a very good and large section on Chinese updates, and most importantly, one of the more interesting parts is the book is split four ways, or not split four ways, sorry. There are four battles in the book which help contextualize the reasons for changes, or just generally like how the tank is faring in the war.
Yeah, definitely. So the big draw for this book for everyone, if not the factory level production change narrative, because this is also quite a wordy book at I think 130,000 words.
132,000 words, thank you.
130,000. Yeah, very, very long book. But the approximately 600 images that we have in the book, all of which are more or less unique, although Maxim Kumulets very kindly gave us access to some archival photographs of prototypes like the T-34M model, the T-43, but the overwhelming majority are private photographs taken by German soldiers during the Great Patriotic War. And we also have many pictures taken by Chinese, I guess, soldiers as like tourist photos. So they would stand in front of Gate Guardian T-34s, or in some cases photos, the tank regiment. So those kinds of photos as well. We also have American ones from the Korean War, which are absolutely fantastic and are great for our final battle section, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the majority of these are absolutely unique. You cannot get them anywhere else. They were very, very expensive in some cases, as Francis will tell you.
I know my mum is watching right now, so I'll get this out of the way. I spent more money on this book than I'd perhaps like to admit. But honestly, I think that it was worth it. I think that the quality and the diversity of photographs that we have are honestly second to none, at least not in the volumes that we've got. And I'll take this opportunity to flash a couple on screen while we're talking.
Because it's not just a case of, we have almost all of the major production variants. I think there are several very rare ones which just don't happen to make it into the photographic record for various reasons. And I think at this juncture, it's probably worth just briefly mentioning how these pictures work, because it forms the central source of the book. Because whereas, you would like to use archives, Russian archives, obviously former Soviet archives, to look at things such as production changes. Okay, well, where's the order that says produce this kind of jack block, or move, this fuel cell over here? Well, the reality is that a lot of these orders are either missing, were never codified, or, as is unfortunately the case, we just don't have access to them, because Russian archives, unlike how they've been for 20 years, they've become quite restrictive now. So unless you're part of an institution and very luckily get access to the archives, unfortunately you can't use them. But the archives aren't exactly infallible, and the reason photographs are great is because so many undocumented changes are there. Now, there is a lot more in the archives than you might imagine. People like Alexei Makarov from the T-34 interest group do some very, very good work, and so does Yuri Pashalov. They do great work with the archives, but it's not the whole story that you're going to get from them. And so the pictures in this are really going to tell you the story from a very different perspective. And so maybe you just want to talk a bit more about how the photographs work, who took them, why, and how do we have them in our collections now?
Sure. So as previously stated, the overwhelming majority of the photographs in the book are private photographs taken mostly by German soldiers during the Second World War, but there are also some original wartime and post-war Soviet photographs, a few photographs,
and a few others, different things, Americans, Chinese,
American
very
GIs,
stuff.
what have you.
But what's the nature of German photos? Why are they taking them, and why do we now have them?
So I like to say that when the Germans went to war, they went with a rifle in one hand and a camera in the other. Lots of Germans took cameras with them to the front because, you know, this was the great victory compared to World War One, and they wanted to take lots of photographs of what they saw to remember, you know, the war. An awful lot of the photographs in the book aren't necessarily photographs that are taken during battle. Quite a lot of these pictures are taken by secondary rear line troops, lots of photographs from lorry drivers. Basically, they're marching through Russia, the Soviet Union, during the invasion, and they see a knocked out Soviet tank and they think, wow, wouldn't it be cool to take a picture? So they do. The war happens, they develop the pictures during the war, they make photo albums, they keep these photos until the end of the war, and obviously the war doesn't go too well, and due to some of the more nasty things that happened during the war, the photo albums end up getting put away and forgotten about. People don't remember what they did and what their fathers did during the war. Fast forward to modernity, and these people, you know, either pass away or they sell on a lot of their personal effects, and the photographs end up getting split up from albums, and that's where they end up in our hands. And these photographs are such amazing primary sources because, you know, these are taken by guys, you know, at these locations, and we see a real like soldier's eye view of these vehicles. So they're not always necessarily the most photogenic pictures, and we don't always have the full context, but they give us such a fantastic way to analyze the T-34, which is essentially, you know, in conjunction with what documents we do have and what facts are known about factories and production, we're able to collate that into a pretty comprehensive look at the T-34 and its production. Would you not agree?
And so when we're talking about production changes, you know, we're thinking about things like developing new fuel tanks, new placements, even just simple things such as moving the saw to the front of the tank from the rear or whatever, you know, things like road wheels changing, and obviously the big changes being turrets, guns, that kind of thing. And so we get into that as well. But also some really exciting things such as plates to the tanks, whether they're repair plates or up armor plates. So we managed to do quite a lot of justice to some of the really rare stuff that I think is going to interest real T-34 experts, generalists, model makers are going to have an absolute field day with this tank. There's going to be so many pictures that you can use to do dioramas with, to copy the turret slogans, such as the Bagration, a famous T-34.
Made famous by the picture that I watermarked and put up and then got turned into a decal.
which is great. That's exactly. I mean, that's great. I mean,
no, it's fantastic.
Commission. Well, I'm not asking for commission. You might, but
no.
You know,
I think it's wonderful. I really do, because it's this sort of stuff that I'm hoping the book is also going to like generate. Like, because we've got such a fantastic and diverse range of vehicles with interesting camouflages, interesting markings. There's just so much on offer. It really is.
Here's the really unique thing about the book. We have our own designation system for the T-34. We break T-34s down into any category that you use to categorize a T-34 is more or less arbitrary, because there were effectively three models of the T-34 as far as the Red Army was concerned. There was the T-34, which is the generic name for any T-34 with a 76mm gun. There's a T-34-85, and then there's a T-34 with Zeiss 2 57mm gun, and those are the only three designations that we really have for real. What we've done is quite, I mean, it's not arbitrary, but we've broken down production types of the vehicles based on all of these technical features, road wheels, you know, jack block placements, these kinds of things, which might seem unimportant to people who aren't interested in these esoteric details, but actually from working back very carefully, we can sort of figure out roughly when they left the factory and roughly when the batch came out. And so we give them all kinds of different names that are really, it's nomenclature for the book, but actually it's a very good way of categorizing them beyond the usual T-34 M1940, which doesn't really make sense because, you know, a T-34 from 1940 could look very different from one to another factory to another. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think like if we're using like the term 1940 specifically, which is always referred to as the L11 tanks, yeah, production of them began in 1940, but most of them are made in 41. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the dated nomenclature, and we went to absolute great lengths to make a more coherent continuum of names and nomenclature. Now, in the book, we are very, very clear that it's not the official names of these vehicles, and it's definitely, I think, one of the more interesting things we've done. And I'm hoping that, yeah, I'm hoping that it's embraced for what it is, because we went to great lengths to sort of say, like, pull apart each tank and see what's different and build a picture of how production evolved at the factories from one vehicle to the next, or one batch of vehicles to the next.
And we do a job of contextualizing it as well. So like we've said, we have these 4 battle sections. Now, they're not just squirreled away in one part of the book as like an appendix. No, instead, they're interspersed throughout the book at different points. So we'll have a long section about, you know, this factory is producing this until this date, and then suddenly we'll say, okay, we're going to stop the production narrative here. We're going to stop talking about jack blocks. I don't know why I'm so obsessed with jack blocks. It's just
I'm the one that's obsessed with them.
You know what it is? It's because of that. It's because of that STZ T-34 that isn't STZ.
Oh, you're talking about the one at Bovington. Ah,
yeah.
Yes. Where, yeah, that did annoy me. Plastered all over Facebook as an STZ T-34 because it's got the 8-bolt wide turret rear, and you know.
So for those who aren't too familiar with the T-34, that's Stalingrad Tractor Factory made a T-34. That's one of the many factories that made the T-34, and all the different factories do, for the most part, very slightly different things to the T-34, and that's the reason why we can differentiate them, because all of these little tiny technical features are some quite big actually.
Yeah.
We can tell them apart.
But yeah, the one at Bovington, the placement of the jack block is KHPZ 183 at Kharkov, the Kharkov Locomotive and Tractor Factory. So hopefully with the release of this book, some of those little things that annoy me will be less annoying, because people will be able to see, oh look, you know, using this book we can see that this tank is not this, it's this.
So I think we'll just briefly talk about the battle sections. I mean, they largely speak for themselves. The first one we actually do is quite early on in the book, before T-34 production even begins. It's the T-26s at Cesena in the Spanish Civil War. The first fielding of the T-26, they're pretty much one of the major pieces of combat that the T-26 sees before the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets knew it. And it's interesting because it parallels our other battles so nicely. And in a nutshell, Republican T-26 is commanded and mostly crewed by Soviet crews, but also with a few Spanish gunners. They attack a few villages not too far from Madrid. They're supposed to do it with infantry, but the infantry fall behind very quickly, and so you just have these T-26s zip down the road and start shooting everything possible, and it's an absolute mess. And ultimately, no gains are made by the Republican forces. Nationalists managed to destroy a handful of T-26s. End of battle. Very interesting for the Soviets. It's part of the Spanish Civil War that informs Soviet tank development. So they start to realize things like, okay, we need to rethink this T-26 concept. Armor's not big enough. We'd like to replace the 45mm gun, although, you know, it's a very potent gun, does a lot of stuff, but they still want to replace it. And then we jump into the next battle.
Well, I was going to say, we use it to, like, because obviously the BT series is the T-34's progenitor. We use Cesena to sort of summarize the general combat experience in Spain. We talk about the work that was then done on the BT series in particular that led us to T-34.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice to talk about a battle of the BTs, but unfortunately, I think only 50 were sent to Spain. They're very, very disliked by Republican and nationalist crews alike, to the point where we've even seen a BT that's been used as a train stopper at the end of a track, because they just do not like the BT, and for various reasons. I mean, partly because spare parts are so rare, but partly because it's just mechanically unreliable, and the wheel drive track is just... But anyway, I digress. So maybe the next battle we should talk about, which would be the...
It's the 21st Tank Brigade's assault on Kalinin.
So this is the Great Patriotic War now. We've very much moved in. You know, this is after our section about the initial T-34s.
Yeah, so the 21st Tank Brigade, as I wrote in my article on Tank Encyclopedia, can be regarded somewhat as the Brigade of Heroes. It was the 21st Tank Brigade was made up of men from the Saratov Tank School and other more experienced tank crew, and they were given a very difficult task of liberating the city of Kalinin, which was the north of Moscow, which had been captured a few days before. They didn't have much support of anything. It was just the 21st Tank Brigade with its predominantly T-34s, but also a few T-60s, and a very small amount of infantry that were tasked with retaking an entire city, which is obviously not feasible. But they did their absolute best, and they did a pretty good job of driving up the highway towards Kalinin, shooting at everything that they could. They even made it to the city and got into some pretty interesting duels with anti-aircraft guns on an airfield, engaging some of the aircraft on the airfield. Obviously, if you know anything about Kalinin, quite famously getting into a tussle with some Stugs and ending up one of the T-34s ended up ramming it. It's not a successful venture because there was no planning behind the engagement, as it were. It was a very desperate attempt to try to retake the city, which ultimately failed.
And it threw serious veterans into, veterans of Khalkhin Gol, those sorts of battles, into the pit of fire that extended from the Ukrainian SSR to Moscow and from the Baltics to Leningrad. Just absolutely threw them in, and in many ways threw them away. And it's interesting to compare it to the Battle of Sasania. So when you get the book, which I hope you all do, of course, read those two together. We don't put them together in the book because it's interesting to contextualize them, but read those two together and you'll see they're very similar battles. It's almost like they didn't learn the lessons from Spain. But I should also quickly point out, this is when T-34s with 57mm guns were fielded. So people interested in those will absolutely love to read this battle. And what you'll find out very quickly is that no matter how good the tank is on paper with the gun, the gun, very potent, very good anti-tank weapon, tactics actually matter quite a lot. And unfortunately, the tactics at Kalinin don't make any sense. And the production changes to the T-34 continue after this, and we then get into the first T-34-85 battle quite far down. This is the Battle of Ogledow, which I think you should talk about, Francis.
So the Battle of Ogledow is a engagement during the later stages of Operation Bagration. It's in Poland, and it's quite important because it's a time when we see a far more coherent use of, a more applicable use of the tanks. So the T-34s involved basically went into the village at Ogledow, where there was some German tanks which were already abandoned. They knew that the Germans were going to come and try to reclaim these vehicles. So they set up an ambush on the far side of the village and let the German tanks come onto them. They disguised the tanks as giant bales of hay, and waited for the Germans to come onto them, which of course they did. It wasn't the first engagement of the T-34-85s, but it was the first time that the T-34 had engaged the new German Panzer VII, the so-called Königstiger, King Tiger.
Königstiger.
Königstiger. And the Soviets came off very well. They didn't lose any vehicles, and the Germans lost several King Tigers, one of which is currently sitting at Patriot Park. It was a fantastic way. It was really good for the Soviets. They'd captured 3 King Tigers almost damage-free in their first showing on the Eastern Front. But we sort of, what we see is the evolution of tactics, planning, looking at the ground, looking at the enemy they're fighting. It's completely different to earlier, where it's just a case of throw the tanks into a situation and let them sort it out for themselves.
Yeah, and I think the parallel story that unfortunately we couldn't write because it would expand the book into about triple the length, but it's very much the human factor when it comes to these vehicles, and part of this book and part of the reason we write the battle sections is to have this intervention into the age-old debate that people have on Facebook or that sort of thing. Was the T-34 the best tank of the war, or was it a good tank? And what we point out, and we very much agree with a scholar called Boris Kovalchik, who wrote a very good article in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies based on a US report of the T-34. His final sort of point about the T-34, because he analyzes the report and he says, well, every weapon has more or less its positives and negatives, and we completely agree. But we take this further, and our argument is, we do have an appendix that goes through this, but our argument is basically, on paper, the weapon can have whatever qualities it wants, but when it comes down to it, the human factor is quite deciding. And so when we move into the 4th battle section, which is actually in the Korean War, very early in the Korean War, in July, the Battle of Taejon, we show that actually sound infantry tactics, it can work very well. And, these aren't necessarily perfectly comparable battles. It's certainly not a scientific endeavor, although it is a historical one, not a science. And we look at this battle where US forces, very depleted US forces with a little bit of support from the Republic of Korea's army, defend this city against North Korean People's Army, which is attacking with T-34-85s. They roll into the city, and we get this narrative from a very interesting perspective, from the Americans' perspective, from Major General William F. Dean. And Francis, if you have any pictures of any of the tanks that have the graffiti, now's a good time to pull them up.
I didn't.
Pull them up. We have time. We have time. Don't worry. It's from the perspective of him, who he has this autobiography that he writes after the war, because he was, spoiler alert, Dean was captured because the city wasn't defended very well and he got lost at the end of the battle. But we look into this battle as a sort of, if you read it against Sasenia and Kalinin, although it's from a very different perspective, you'll sort of see that some of the tactics are slightly different. So the North Korean tanks deliver snipers into the city quite early on in the battle. And what you don't necessarily get from reading Dean's reports, there's the American reports that we've also read, but mainly we use Dean's autobiography, although it's fraught with problems, which we don't need to get into for all history problems. But what you don't get necessarily is the problems that the snipers are causing. And it's this combined tactics that the North Korean People's Army uses that really makes their assault quite successful, in addition to the US forces being quite depleted. And so we recount that story from Dean's perspective, and it makes her, if I say so, a very interesting read. And I guess it really does sort of end up being the capstone to our argument of, look how important tactics are, because the T-34-85, it's a good tank by anyone's measure, more or less. It's not outdated by 1950, but it has its many, many problems, which is a question we'll come to a little bit later on in the stream. But it's on par or thereabouts in a sort of layman's way with the American armour. Certainly with the ones that were at Taijon, because American tanks arrived later on in the battle. I think it's Chaffee's and Stewart's, if I remember rightly. So interesting battle, and I don't want to spoil it too much because it's it's a good read.
Again,
I
don't want to spoil.
But,
I don't want to spoil so much of the book because, you guys to go and get it because I think it's worth a read.
There is a fifth battle in the book actually, which we'll come back to. It's T-34-85-215 of the Chinese Volunteer Army in Korea. As far as I'm concerned, it's a Chinese Communist Party myth on par with Be Like Comrade Lai Fung or Gongqian tank. It just smacks of nonsense. And we asked Stephen Zaloga, famous tank historian Stephen Zaloga, if he can corroborate this story of a Chinese T-34-85 that destroys, countless bunkers, M46 or whatever pattern tanks. It's just such a nonsense story. So we have it in an endnote. But Zaloga said he didn't find any reports on this, although, to be fair, American reports weren't very well kept by the end of the war. But in any case,
I think
it's
the battle stuff is important to contextualize, but ultimately it's not the main focus of the book. And if you're looking for a book on good T-34 battles, we've got 3 fantastic retellings of T-34 battles, but they're used to sort of contextualize the tank and how its production changes affect it on the battlefield as much as tactical changes as well.
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth turning to the next thing we should really talk about, which is how our title differs to other T-34 books. Because, even in the last 3 years, there have been some really good T-34 books. I'm thinking Peter Samsonov's designing the T-34. I'm thinking of Skolsky's 2-volume series on camouflage. I'm sure there have been a couple of others.
Yeah, there's a really good
slip
book.
My mind right now.
There's a really good book to my right.
M1940. It uses M1940, doesn't it?
Yeah. Tankergrad publishing the first T-34. So to sort of answer your question, the book is quite different. So if you want a book which is all battles and all personal stories, this isn't the book for you. What makes our book unique is we've attempted something very difficult in chronicling the production changes of the T-34 throughout its entire production history. No
other books doing that to the same extent at the same level. Some books will go into really in terms of some detail about the engine, how many screws that's got. That's not quite what we do.
And I think we do a good job of broadly covering a lot of subjects. So if you wanted to read a really, really, really good book on prototyping of the T-34, I'd recommend Peter Samsonov's book. Fantastic.
And I second that because Samsonov is a really good writer. It's written lucidly, and we obviously talk about the T-34 prototypes. We give what needs to be said for our project, which is to chronicle the design changes. But if you want to know everything about prototypes, obviously Samsonov's book's the place to go. He should give us money for plugging his book. So I know you're listening, Samsonov. You owe us. Right, I think we better move on. Here's a good one. Tell us about the technical drawings and illustrations, because I know a lot of people will be really interested in those.
Cool. So I'll start with technical drawings, and then we'll talk about illustrations. And that's not because our illustrator's currently in the chat, and I want to leave you on tenterhooks. If you move within T-34 circles online, especially on Facebook, hopefully you'll be very familiar with Mark Retheret, who is a fantastic a producer of T-34 technical drawings. He does it all in his spare time. He's a really, really talented, really, really nice guy. And when I saw his work a few years ago, I thought, no, I gotta have him for this book.
How many have we got in the book, technical drawings, and what are they? So they're profiles, right? Or
yeah, so we have about 40 different technical drawings in the book. Currently on screen is one of them, obviously all rights to Mark Referet, of a soft edge and a hard edge hexagonal turret. Most of the technical drawings are profiles from the front and the side and the rear if we can, and the top if we can. However, there are also some technical drawings of specifics. So like you can see on screen, we've got a technical drawing of some turrets, lots of technical drawings of track. We did a lot of work on T-34 track and working out what factories are using some of the more rarer types of track. His art is honestly stunning, and if you are familiar with his work, then I don't need to tell you that. Fantastic, fantastic work. I'm really, really pleased to see, to get
and
his
you will
stuff.
be too as the reader, because a lot of these pictures aren't necessarily perfect. People stand on the tanks because they're largely what we call tourist photos, and so when we talk about certain details, really clean images, and as you can see on screen, they're really clean images. And so you'll be able to flick to that section and say, okay, here we go. Let's look at the technical drawings. And it serves as a nice little quick reference guide for some of the trickier stuff. And, obviously, if you're an artist, which is who we'll talk about next, they're very useful. So JC Amazing Ace, I've known him for many years now. He's the guy who's done our side profiles. He does a lot of work for Tanks Encyclopedia. He's a Renault FT specialist. So if you're interested in the Renault FT, speak to him. Some really gorgeous side profiles. I think we have 20 in the book. We did have more, but constraints on what they are.
Yeah.
And we've picked some of the nicest, most interesting camouflage schemes, some of the most interesting T-34 variants, or sub-variants rather, because we just figure everyone can do a basic 4BO T-34. No one does them for very good reason. They're boring. The modelers are going to love them, seeing them. So we've got some great ones. So Bagratian's in there, of course, one of our favorites. Some really nice camouflaged L11. We've got Chinese T-34 85s and Type 58s.
The famous chicken wire quotes winter camouflage on a hexagonal. But also, as you have seen on the screen for the last minute or so, one of our personal tanks, the Stompy Garden T-34, even makes a nice little art piece. Very, very pleased we could get that one in. The love tank.
So some really nice ones in there. Certainly going to give inspiration for model makers who will obviously also enjoy the photos, as we mentioned. So really fun stuff. And I guess whilst we're talking about nice variants, you should probably mention what super rare variants and what images do we have in the book of those super rare variants?
Well, it wouldn't be the most complete pictorial history of the T-34 if we didn't have some pretty rare stuff in there. As already discussed briefly earlier, we have T-34s with Zis for 57mm guns.
I said Zis too earlier, my mistake.
Yeah, I'll let it slide.
No, you should correct me.
I've got, in my personal collection, I've got some photographs of some of the rarer examples with the 57mm gun, because there's only 2 known in the photographic record, 2 tanks, and both of them are in the book, which is pretty cool. We've got a plethora of flame-throwing T-34s. So to answer Blue Hammer 32's question, yes, we do have OT-34s in the book. We also have, we've got OT-34 85s, which is pretty rare. Got a nice picture of one of those on a parade ground, which is pretty awesome. Quite glad to get that one in. To continue with the flamethrowers, we have a exquisitely rare photograph of a STZ manufactured T-34, which has got fog to flamethrower units on the side of the tank. This was a infield conversion and it's just really funky. Can't wait for you to see that. 2 more I'll mention, and I know Will's chomping at the bit for me to get the picture up of one of them. I've got a couple of photographs in the book of a T-34 command tank, which has got a exhaust pipe coming out of the side of the hull. That's for a generator that produces electricity for extra radio equipment, being a command tank. And if you bear with me, because I've got to get it up. Ta-da! We've got one of these. This is a T-34 with shielding for embarked infantry. We have 3 photographs of it in the book. It's a really funky tank. I won't give too much of it away because I want you guys to pick up the book and read it. 2 of these vehicles at least were manufactured in the field. The shielding is for infantry to be protected from small arms fire. If you look really closely at the back of them, you can see there's a couple of square pistol ports. There's some at the back and some at the front. This is a really, really funky conversion done, and we're really lucky to have 3 high-definition photographs in the book of this conversion. So you should be stressed that if you are interested in a type of T-34, it's probably in the book. I can only think of like 3 sub-variants that aren't in the book, and we're talking like tanks with a particular pattern of road wheels. So in other words, we've got a super large, super diverse range of pictures that go from the very common to the super rare, and I think that people will really, really like what we've got to show.
And I think if we can just get serious for a moment, because it is a serious topic, we're talking about the T-34 like it's a sort of classic car type thing that everyone can enjoy. Now, I do think it is worth stressing that these aren't classic cars. At the end of the day, they're weapons of war, and people died fighting in them. People died fighting against them. For some people, they're symbols of glory, for allegedly winning the Second World War, as some people would like to say. They're also symbols of oppression for many people who either they fought against them in wars or uprisings. And so when you look at pictures in the book, you will actually see quite a few where you can see corpses either in the tank or have just come out of the tank. And you can usually make out a roughly human figure, often quite disfigured. Now, we don't have that many graphic photos. Francis and I both own really graphic photos of crews and soldiers who've been killed, mutilated. These are in the book aren't too graphic, but we don't shy away from the fact that these are in the book, and we'll always say when we have a picture where there's a corpse, because at the end of the day, these are just as much weapons of war as they are in our pictures that we have, tombs for people who have died. And so I think, and I know model makers might not like being preached to like this, but I'm not trying to preach, but you do have to remember that these are weapons at the end of the day. And that's all I want to say on that. And we bring it in the book, but a lot of these pictures will be the final pictures of someone's body before they're buried. And so we have to be respectful in that sense. And so it does give me pause for concern when we have these pictures in the book, but it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that covers really the book in total, and we'll probably turn to some questions that we've had sent in or people have been commenting in the comments in a
yes,
second.
So please, that's something I should have said.
Get those questions in there, guys, because we're reading the chat.
Yeah, we're reading the chat.
Maybe we should just say where you can get the book, how much it is, pre-orders.
Sure, so currently, if you live in the UK, you can get this book from Amazon. You can get it directly from the Fonthill website. You can get it from Waterstones, a big British book chain, and it should be available in some other locations. I'm sort of hoping that the Tank Museum will stock copies, so go out and get one of those. If you live in Europe, there is a bookshop. Oh, I should have prepared and got the link. There is a bookshop out of Germany which is currently stocking it. There's also one out of Finland which is currently stocking it. If you live in America we are expecting Amazon links to come up soon. The book should be available in the United States. There's no reason it wouldn't. Our first book, Fallen Giants, was available in the United States, so don't you worry. With the moment we can get American links to Amazon, we'll send them to you. And if we find any other American bookstores selling it, we'll also send it your guys' way.
But the best place is probably going to be Fonthill Media's website. So we'll give a link to that later.
I have one on
Fonthill Media's website. I'll pop that in the chat. Yeah,
Oh.
Fonthill Media. I think the postage rates are quite reasonable for most of the world. So probably the best place. So I guess we'll move on to questions. I think here's one that you'll definitely like to field. Did T-34 optics get better as the war continued?
Yes, is the simple answer. There's a bit of a misconception that T-34s at one point or another were fielded with no optics whatsoever, and this is a complete piece of fabrication. During the testing of the two prototypes, a report was produced, the April report, which gave a list of issues that the tank had, and some of the issues pertain to optics. They found that especially pieces of armoured glass were manufactured with air bubbles on it. The periscopes weren't in ideal locations. When the gun fired, the glass would sometimes break. So these sort of teething problems through prototyping. To fast forward to the sort of mid to late war period, the MK4 periscope is fielded, which greatly improves the optics of the tank and the ability for crew to look out of. When the T-34-85 is manufactured, it obviously gets paired with a new gun sight, the TSH-16, which is a really, really good gun sight. Kind of similar to the German gun sights. It's articulated. It's just a pretty good piece of vision equipment. As an aside, as me and Will have both crewed T-34s, we can tell you that the optics are terrible. the crew vision is atrocious.
We'll give a shout out to John Dale, Alex Hall, and Tim Isaac of the Cobburton Collection in the United Kingdom for letting us crew their vehicles. Those are runners as well, and obviously the Mandela Way T-34, 85. We obviously helped with that project. That's not a runner, not yet at least anyway. But so we deal with those. Yeah, the thing about optics as well is if you're not familiar with tanks, maybe you're familiar with driving a large vehicle like a van. I couldn't imagine driving a van without mirrors. Now the T-34 does not have mirrors. So a general problem with tanks, largely even today, I think you could argue, situational awareness is always pretty bad. Optics are super important, but you're never going to have perfect vision from a tank anyway. The T-34 starts out quite rudimentary, as we say, but it does eventually get better. You know, Soviet engineers are certainly not stupid. You know, the wartime constraints on materials are quite bad, but towards the end of the war, things start to change. Lend-Lease actually helps out quite a lot with certain things. Rubber, I believe, actually, is a big thing. So big changes there. Next question.
Just before we end that question,
go
on. Tank Archives asked a question about, or continued asking a question about optics. He said, speaking of optics, I've seen photos of tanks, I think STZ, with a slot for an infantry periscope. How often does that show up in photos? I have now put on screen a very poorly watermarked version of one of the photographs which does appear in the book of a Krasny Samovo 112 manufactured T-34, which also has the infantry periscope on the glacis. I can't remember off the top of my head what the order was, but there was an order given to do with vision inside the tank for the crew, and one of the short-term fixes for the optics was to put I can't remember off the top of my head as well the model designation, but an infantry periscope. And This tank, as you can see, has taken some serious damage, some serious shots to the front, which has blown off the driver's hatch. But just at the centre of the glasses plate, the top left of the driver's hatch, you can see the periscope, which has had the armoured cap blown away. So I hope that that answers your question.
It's pictures like this that have these incredible details. If you have an eye for detail like us do, you're going to really enjoy this book, because there are some great things. I mean, there are some really weird things, actually. Like in the Korean War, we see a teddy bear in one of the T-34 driver's hatches, which is absolutely fantastic, you know.
The little human touches.
All kinds of little crazy details that we see. And that's going to really inspire model makers. But it's a visual delight. But again, you know, you'll also see corpses. So it's not all fun. But the next question is quite a brief one here. Do we touch upon Israeli T-34s at all?
So some photographs of T-34s in Israel appear in the book. We kindly received some photographs to use from a couple of people. So first of all, thank you to Ed Oakham, who donated quite a few original photographs he took in the 1970s of the Golan Heights of some Syrian Czechoslovakian T-34-85s. I'd also like to thank Andrei Ferzov, who wrote the absolutely fantastic book, Surviving T-34 Tanks in Israel. I look over there because it's sitting pride of place on top of my my bookshelf. It is one of the books that I was also slightly involved in. A couple of my pictures ended up in it. He donated a couple of original photographs in modernity of a T-34 being used as a static gun placement somewhere in Israel. So thank you guys so much for your contribution. There was a fantastic book released not that long ago as well about the Israeli use of the T-34. We don't go into massive detail on Israeli T-34s. We use pictures of T-34s in Israel when discussing the production of Czechoslovakian T-34s. Syria and Egypt received a number of them, and the photographs we have of them were really useful for looking at like the turret seams and the Syrian DSHK mount on the turret.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. And one of the things that we had to really cut from the book, because we were way over the contracted word limit, like way over.
Oh, nearly half, I think.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. Was foreign variants. You know, we started off and we really wanted to look at things like, you know, the Egyptian and Syrian self-propelled guns. Cuban one would be very interesting. And well, we kind of decided we don't really have the photos for it. We definitely don't have the information for it. It would extend the project time far too much. It's something we could do in the future, but I'm not too optimistic about finding out information about these super rare variants, super rare foreign variants, because as we'll come to later on when we talk about the Chinese T-34s, there are so many source problems with these super rare variants. And the fact that no one's written things about them already, despite their relative fame, it should really speak volumes about how much we can find out. So, you know, it's one of those things. I think we'll move on to another question here. Oh, okay, we'll do the Chinese T-34 question now.
You've been itching to get the Chinese. I've already snuck in a couple of like bits of Chinese stuff. I put up the technical drawing for you because I know that's
did you? Oh, very good.
That's your bay.
Well, you know, the thing with Chinese T-34s is that they're very badly understood because of source problems. So in the early 1950s and about 1950s and 1955, the People's Republic of China, relatively newly declared, it signs this treaty of cooperation with the Soviet Union, and they get sold Su-76s, T-34-85s, ISU-122s, ISU-152s, a handful of IS-2s, some other vehicles, Su-100s, at absolutely exorbitant prices. And those are the main tanks in the People's Liberation Army, replacing most of the Japanese vehicles captured during the Civil War. Now, everyone will have probably heard about the so-called Type 58, which is the Chinese modification to the T-34-85. It has a new bracket system for mounting probably a Type 54, which is a copy of the DSHK heavy machine gun. And it has a torsion bar at the back to open up the engine access port, as well as a couple other small things. A new commander's cupola, well, 2 cupolas now instead of the regular 1, some of which are very, very crude with absolutely no glass, but slits cut in the armor for vision ports. Very strange. And so the question is, did the Chinese ever produce T-34s in license? And if so, were they exported? I can deal with the export question quite quickly, but I think the first thing to do is talk about source problems. So the problem with Chinese T-34-85 is that in some ways we're in a much worse position than, say, I don't know, Zaloga and Granson would have been when they were investigating Soviet tanks, back in the 80s. There's a big problem with archives. Now, obviously, as one of the other commenters asked us about access to archives, we have none for the Chinese T-34-85s, absolutely none. They're very secretive. It's just impossible to get to them. So we don't know anything about what's inside Chinese archives, apart from things which have been reproduced in museums, such as in the Beijing Tank Museum. So big problem. We do have CIA reports and CIPRI, which they can be interesting photographic surveillance things telling us in the 70s, 60s, 70s how many T-34s are knocking about in China. Very interesting stuff, but unfortunately not that helpful for the production history. So what's the next best source if we don't have archives? Well, we have photographs, okay? We've got tourist pictures from Chinese soldiers. We also have modern museum examples because there are a lot of Chinese T-34-85s and so-called Type 58s. Think about 1800 were supplied to the People's Republic. So we can look at the pictures that we have and say, okay, well, here are the standard sort of modifications and here are the little weird outliers. So if you want to pull up some pictures, Francis.
Yeah, which one do you want?
Let's have the Type 54 mount on the side of the turret. So they do all these kinds of little, modifications, and we can say, okay, well, more or less all of the so-called Type 58s have these technical features, and so that's part of the standard design. And then we can look at other sort of things, such as the exhaust change. Now you can pull that up because that's a really interesting one. We've seen an SU-100, I think 2 actually, and a T-34-85, no, a Type 58 actually, with these exhaust changes. What they've done is they've removed the original exhaust ports, which you can clearly see, welded over them, and on the top of the hull, behind the radiator cover, you see 2 little slits.
It's all cut into the radiator cover, yeah.
Yeah, they've added a new exhaust system. Now, the thing is that we have these museums, and museums can restore vehicles very inaccurately. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. But these appear to be legitimate things that were done by the PLA. And so we just have a couple of other sources that I quickly want to talk about. We have oral histories, so things like interviews and memoirs. But there's a memoir, very good memoir, called Engineering Communist China, One Man's Story by Dan Ling and Yuli Sun. And it's a story about a guy who worked in a Chinese tank factory and eventually got declared an enemy of the people. It's a very interesting story for Chinese sort of political history, but the reason we're interested in it is because he talks about how they were supposed to produce T-34s at this factory, but then they only repaired the tanks damaged in Korea. And so we can start to piece things together based on very clever source use, whereas we don't have the archives. But the main source is, and I don't like to say this, unfortunately, it's Chinese social media, things like Tieba Baidu, Weibo. Really interesting stuff is written on there. But just as we all know, Facebook's full of nonsense about the T-34. So are Weibo and Tieba Baidu. But the interesting thing is that we have some really interesting stories. So the Type 58 name, for example, we don't really know where that came from. Well, someone suggests, and it's not corroborated, but someone suggests that the so-called Type 54 HMG, when it has the anti-aircraft mount, is designated Type 58. Not corroborated, but an interesting way of looking at it. And the trouble is that you might think, well, why on earth are you using social media as sources? And you're absolutely right. It does seem like a really bad thing to do, and I wouldn't do it if I didn't have to. But I was talking to a guy called Martin Andrew, he did a PhD about PLA. You can read that online, actually. It's not bad. And he was saying, well, the trouble with early Chinese armor, especially prototypes and especially things before the 70s, is that we just don't really have anything on them. And, militaries such as the US Army, they're not really interested in these early things. So very little research is actually out there. And so those which we have, well, people in China, obviously, they want to know their own history, and they'll talk about, what they think happened. And there's a story, and I use the story word I say story, I mean that quite seriously. We have stories that the T-34 was slated to be produced in China, and then various retellings of this story on social media say, well, either they produced tracks or they produced a small series of T-34s. Absolutely no proof whatsoever. But there are some interesting little nuggets of details that they come out with on Chinese social media. And so we retell this in the book very tentatively and say, look, here's what's claimed. And we say, well, some of it's obviously nonsense, some of it's not. Here are reasons why we might want to accept certain things. Here are reasons why we might not want to. So things like Yuri Pashvlok, for example, he said, well, when he went looking through Chinese T-34s, actually in China, he said, well, he never saw Chinese serial numbers. They were all Soviet serial numbers. And so when it comes to Chinese T-34 production, I think it's a case of someone somewhere has got a bit confused, or they've written something spurious and it's just caught people's attention, and people have repeated it, and suddenly it's this myth. And that's sort of neatly brings us on to the next part of that question, which is Chinese T-34 exports. This is an interesting case in point about people repeating nonsense. The so-called Type 63-65 self-propelled anti-aircraft gun from Vietnam. Francis, you can pull this up.
I've already pulled it up, don't you worry.
You've already pulled good man. There's a suggestion which you can see on Wikipedia in all languages that says it's a Chinese vehicle. And I saw this same information on similar posts to talk about the so-called Type 58 in China. And they all say, yeah, definitely Chinese. Well, it's not. It's the short answer. Because when I tracked that down, that suggestion, it originally came from a 1977 modeling magazine that showed some actually quite good pictures of the vehicle in Vietnam just shortly after its capture. And they said, oh, well, we think it might have had something to do with the Chinese. Absolutely no proof, spurious claim. And that's since been repeated all over the internet. It's absolutely not true as far as anyone can work out. Maybe a Chinese engineer was involved, but there's a photograph from a museum in Hanoi which shows an Su-76 with a superstructure, another T-34 with a, I think it's an 85.
Yeah, I think it was an 85, 52K or something.
Yeah, and it seems to suggest that the North Vietnamese army was upgrading their own T-34s in little workshops to make anti-aircraft guns. And we don't have any proof that the Chinese exported vehicles. One of the ways we could work this out would be to look at the vehicles and say, well, do any of them have Type 58 technical features such as the torsion bar at the rear or the HMG mounts, the second cupola? We haven't seen that. But we should probably stress that the so-called Type 58 package, that wasn't applied to every T-34-85 in China. There are quite a lot of extant examples of just regular T-34-85s. So very, very mysterious. What we present in the book is about the best we can do with the sources we have. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. We have the rough contours, but we've only scratched the surface. So really interesting stuff. We have loads and loads of pictures from the 60s and 70s taken by Chinese people.
Well,
if you're into Chinese T-34s, you're going to love it. But,
I wouldn't be surprised
it's what it is.
I wouldn't be surprised if between us we had probably one of the largest collections of Chinese T-34s outside of China, which, okay, we don't have many, but considering how rare they are, we've got some really good pictures. Really, really, really good pictures.
Oh, yeah, and unfortunately not in the book because they're way beyond the scope, but I've even got an ISU-152 and Su-76. These things are... There's a lot of work that needs to be done on Chinese T-34s, and generally Chinese armor. I'm fortunate to work with people like Malik Cash and Liu Guo, who do a lot of good work on not just Chinese tanks, but other vehicles as well. But unfortunately, these are just very early interventions into the historical record. But, it is what it is.
Well, I think I'll answer one of the questions that was put in the chat.
Yeah, better check the chat.
Which is by Kraut Report, who asks, what were the biggest challenges you ran into? I imagine it isn't easy to get those production variants sorted out without, good access to Russian archives. The biggest challenge for me was, yeah, definitely like categorization. We had limited access to original Soviet sources. We had some fantastic pre-war sources we was able to get, along with some early wartime stuff regarding especially 112 beginning production. There's some good sources out there on that. I think, and Will agree with me, that we spent a long time analysing all the tanks we had to build the picture, and there are stuff that is sprinkled through T-34 production which is a definite. So STZ introduced cast road wheels with internal shock absorbers October 31st, 1941. The cupola on T-34 76s is introduced it's ordered in June 1943, and through the photographic record of Kerrs and other sources, it looks like they physically got to the battlefield in July. So there are nuggets of information we have throughout the production where we can go, well, this definitely happened. T-34-85 production definitely started here, definitely started at this factory. And with a lot of help too, with places like the T-34 interest group, we were
they
able...
do quite a lot of good archive work.
Yeah,
it is very difficult to get access, but people like, for example, Yuri Pashalok, Alexei Makarov, they do a lot of work, and we're obviously very grateful for them contributing to the T-34 interest group. So in many ways, the book it's a compilation of not just, it is predominantly our work from our primary sources being photographs, but also, we're very grateful, and we say this in the book, we're very grateful for all of the work done in the esoteric circles of the T-34 interest group and similar websites and groups. So it really is the sort of last 10 years of T-34 picture collecting, T-34 archive digging. So there are means and ways that we can get around having the limited archival materials. As I say at the start, the archives aren't infallible sources. The reality can be very different to what the reports say. Archives aren't, there's this myth that seems to permeate in military history circles that archives are absolutely be all and end all. And if regulations say this, it must be true. This is absolutely wrong. The photographic record suggests completely, in many cases, to the contrary. And so the fact that we've used photographs, it isn't a cop-out because we don't have access to the archive. That's the wrong way of looking at it. It's a very, very, very useful source that can be a great corrective to the archives. And many other sources can do that. Archives are really, they're good for some things, but not great for others.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think as the people often underestimate what a fantastic primary source these photographs are, just because they're not like clinical or professional photographs doesn't mean that like the vehicle in the picture isn't of worth and can't be analysed. And it's so amazing. At least, I don't know how you feel, Will, but like going through pictures and like every single vehicle has got something interesting going on. Some interesting detail, some interesting way that it's being photographed, and just analysing those is like, wow, I've got such a detailed chronological continuum of T-34 production. Like, you can pick up a German photograph of one of the initial 10 T-34s, A-34s if you want to call them, and you can pick up a German photograph of, or even Soviet late war, post-war photographs of anything, like rebuilds of 76s into 85s with cast wheels or interlocking plates because they're originally manufactured at STZ or something. And
You can even get Chinese T-34s.
Yeah, or Chinese T-34. You're going to get that tattooed on you, Chinese T-34's winky face. But yeah, the photographic history is so stunning, and I mean, unless you follow my Facebook page for Francis Pulham Books, you're not going to have seen most of these photographs. There's a couple which have been published in other books. There are a couple of archive photos. Not a couple. There's archive photos from prototyping of tanks. There's a couple of archive photos as and when I needed them. But so much of what we've got on offer is never before seen.
About 95% of the images in the book, you cannot get them elsewhere. No chance. It's just not possible.
Absolutely.
So I think we'll tackle two really, really big questions now. Ones which I think will... you'll see. What do you think the biggest flaw of the T-34 was? And so I'll just quickly clarify the question there. When it says T-34, I guess it means any of them. Although the problem with that question, there's an inherent problem with that question. Actually, I suppose I'll start answering actually now that I think about it. There's an inherent problem with the question, whereas you wouldn't look at something like the M4A2 Sherman to talk about all Shermans, and you wouldn't talk about the Panzer III-J to talk about all Panzer IIIs. The T-34 is a much more heterogeneous vehicle than you would give it credit for.
100%,
You know,
100%.
I think this is why one of the many reasons we bring in our own designation system, because an STZ T-34 made at the worst part of the war is junk. But one of the late produced T-34-85s with things like the Cyclone air filter, the new 85mm gun, whichever model you like, an inherently superior vehicle, and so they're really not comparable. And if you just say the T-34, your question's fallacious. But what I think the question really is there an inherent thing in the design of T-34?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a straight answer. I think that the T-34 has an inherent design flaw, and that is its suspension. Having crewed a T-34, and when you read the reports, like the April report, it's so clear that space is a massive issue. Obviously, the way that T-34 suspension works is you've got vertical spring suspension, where it creates an almost like double wall effect inside the tank. You've got the sides of the tank, the vertical spring, and then all this negative space in the slope of the armour, which is then filled by fuel tanks, oil tanks, that sort of stuff. But it makes a vehicle which is this wide, actually this wide. And as a crew member, it's just so cramped inside the vehicle. There's just no space. You compare that to a KV-1, a contemporary, which has got torsion bar suspension. It just makes the whole interior of the vehicle that much more spacious. It's something that no matter what T-34 you look at, whether you're looking at the prototype T-34s in 1940, or you're looking at Czechoslovakian T-34s being manufactured in 1956, it's just an inherent design flaw to the entire vehicle, and it's something. At least personally, this is the bit I find most interesting about the entire T-34 story. Is the Soviets knew it was a flawed design almost from the start, and were looking at replacing it, and it's only because of the war and dropping its replacement before it even got started that the T-34 is even regarded in such a high light today. Yeah, to me, that's the biggest design flaw. If you could change the suspension, you'd have an infinitely better tank.
Yeah, I'll give my answer to the question, and then we'll go back to Kraut Report, because he's just asked us a very, very good question that we should have answered earlier. My answer to what the biggest flaw of the T-34 is might sound a little bit left of field, but it's the fact that it was produced in the Soviet Union at a very specific certain time. It comes just after, well, the design is taking place during the Great Purges, and one of the many problems with the Great Purges was that quite a lot of talented Soviet citizens from all in parts of industry, they're arrested, internally exiled, as happened in one case, They can be sent to hard labour. They could even be executed. And so very talented engineers are taken out of the picture of the T-34 design. And it's a similar story that we talk about in Fallen Giants, the T-35A heavy tank. A similar problem, engineers are taken away and designs are suddenly, not fixed when they should be. In addition to the political problems, you have economic ones that the Soviet Union is kind of inherently has, being a command economy. They're inefficient. There's corruption, things like embezzlement, things like black markets, bottlenecks as well. A very bad problem with the command economies, especially in the Soviet case. So that, for me, is the biggest problem with the T-34. It's produced in a state that has state terror, and it has a very, very... I mean, the command economies are great for industrializing semi or unindustrialized states, but it's not ideal. I mean, compared to American production of the Sherman, for example, which is a slightly tricky comparison to make for reasons that we can get into, reasons we get into in the book, actually, a little bit. The T-34 is not a clean product by any stretch of the imagination. No variant or subvariant of the T-34 is a very well polished vehicle, relatively good for Soviet standards, but comparing it to certain international designs, Panzer III, Panzer IV, M4 Sherman, these are not polished vehicles. And I would argue that's part of there's just an inherent problem with the Soviet Union's command economy system. But I think we'll leave that there because it's a different debate, We'll come back to Kraut Report's question. He just wants to know, how do we sort of decide a production variant, a subvariant, based on photos? How do we do that? What's the science, I suppose?
It's not an exact science per se, but there are definite points that we can say, right, here is something that they make a change and it sticks, and we see it in subsequent variants that we don't see in previous variants. So for example, just a really small thing, but something which is quite important, is after the German invasion on June 22nd, 1941, and production of the T-34 increases, one of the things that changes very early on is just the stowage on the exterior of the tank. And it doesn't sound like a big difference, but they just make it a little bit more, I suppose, ergonomic. The gun cleaning toolbox is reduced in size. The spare track box is moved from the left to the right. The two jacks at the rear of the tank, which are stowed on the fenders, the jack blocks are stowed on the fenders, and the two jacks are on the right side of the fender. They ditch one of the jacks, one of the blocks, and the tank just has one. And it's a really tiny change. If you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't know what you're looking at. But it's a change which is subsequent from that vehicle, and in many respects, you see that exact change from when it's done in July, August 1941, all the way to the end of production. The gun cleaning kit stays that size, that pattern on the front left of the fender. And with some exceptions, 112 being a good example, the track toolbox with the track pins, in this case split pins, is on the right. The jack block and jack eventually leaves in 1942. But it's a change which, like, pre that, the stowage is not completely different, but different enough that you can be like, right, here's a cut. Here is where production changed in a subtle way, but we can now define the two types of tanks. You've got the early stowage and the later stowage, or the simplified stowage, whatever you want to call it. I can't remember what we called it off the top of my head. But that can go from great and small. So that's a really small change, just the way the stowage is on the tank, to a big change, like the implementation of the hexagonal turret. Again, that's not cut and dry. They introduced the hexagonal turret at the same time they're still producing the earlier cast and weld turrets, which obviously eventually fade out. and you get this really cool and really interesting mix of like features being added and taken away at the end of 1941, beginning of 1942. And that's actually my favourite period of T-34 production, because it is just so complex. You've got tanks with hexagonal turrets, you've got tanks with the earlier turrets. The rear of the tank can be angled, or the rear of the tank can be bent like the early design with a square transmission hatch. And at least for me, that was some of the most fun, was like, right, how do I name this? And I think I did an alright job. I sort of chose the biggest bits of the changes to be like, right, oops, right, this is what we're focusing on. So I suppose it's arbitrary in the sense of like there's no Russian source being like, bam, this is now called this. But I think I did a very sensible job at being like, okay, here's a big change. This is now where I'm going to make that decision. And it should be stressed that this nomenclature is not like an official Soviet thing at all. It's just what we used in the book to try to show you how much is changing, especially how quickly it's changing, and at times pointing out how subtle it can be. It can be as subtle as a bit of track stowage is moved, or it can be as big as they've got a new turret or a new rear plate or anything really.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense in the book. We do have a big section on how to use this book, and we explain our methodology quite clearly. It makes a lot more sense when you get the book. I mean, we spent a long time making sure that this was not just that it made sense, but actually it was quite accessible, or at least as accessible as we possibly could get it, for newer readers or people who are less experienced with tanks. So it sounds more complicated than it is. Now, we touched briefly on ergonomics. Obviously, we've crewed T-34-85s. I think it'd be nice to talk for just a couple of minutes about that, because we've crewed fairly late model T-34-85s, a couple of Czechoslovak production ones, which are relatively good, sort of nice products in terms of the finish. The thing that strikes me is I can't imagine how hard it must have been to get into a T-34 without handrails, because we reenact. Actually, you've seen the pictures on the stream already, so we do it in uniform. And I'll tell you right now, I don't think I could get it past health and safety if the tanks didn't have handrails, because well, you slipped, funnily enough, didn't you, once?
Yeah, so the second year I went to Capel, Capel Tank Show hosted by John Dale, fantastic show. Please go. We go every year, and we'll be going this year when it goes ahead. I was on the T-34, and we'd just been around the arena, and we were now back where the tank was parked. And there was a group of civilians, a group of punters, walking behind the tank, clearly in their own little world, didn't notice a 30-ton war machine trying to reverse into a parking space. And the tank hadn't started moving yet. And all I did was, I was sitting on the rim of the cupola. I stood up, so I got physically onto the turret roof, because I was trying to shout to them, move back. But if you've ever tried to shout over a V2 34 engine, it's hard. And it was just at that moment that the driver, Alex Hall, decided that he was going to move backwards. And of course, all my balance goes, and over I go, and I land quite heavily on the engine deck, or the bruise I had after that was quite something. But yeah.
I mean, it's not a well finished product. Not like, so people who obviously own Shermans have jumped on T-34s, and they've been like, what on earth is this?
Well, it made me laugh when you said that the late war T-34s that we had crewed were of good quality. Like, no offense to Tim and his tank, because his tank is absolutely stunning. It's the nicest T-34 I've ever crewed. But the casting on that tank is rough. Like, do you remember we were at Minehead, and we were analysing the turret seam, and we were just like, oh my god, this is horrible.
I mean, there are even reports in the Aberdeen report where they say rainwater can just permeate the vehicle in all kinds of places, which, hey, it's great if you want to ford a river, but if you're doing a march on a really rainy day, you're not going to have a nice day. So when it comes to ergonomics, this is not the vehicle. if if there was a ministry of tanks, this would not pass its MOT at all. Like they are rough. They're death traps, quite frankly. And when we do these shows, I almost want to take out dental insurance every time I get in and out of the turret, because it's so rough. I mean, you can chop your thing. The hatches are really heavy. I dread to think what the early tanks with the big hatch were like, because these ones are just individual ones for each crew member. Those big hatches must have been super heavy, and it's no wonder they replaced them. But it surprises you how long it took to replace them.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember trundling around Capel the first year I went, and I got a ride in a T-34, and I'm sitting in the commander's seat, and I'd gone from perched on top of the cupola inside, so I'm looking through the vision ports, and one of these lids comes slamming down, and thank God it wasn't the one with the MK4 periscope, because otherwise, well, I would have lost the top of my head. It came down with such a force, I thought that something had gone wrong. Like, it made such a bang. No, sod that. I love these tanks.
It's rough, and this is why we have safety briefings at every show, because these are really dangerous vehicles if you're not careful. And obviously,
absolutely,
it's one of those things. I mean, I caught the back of my gymnasterka, which is a tunic, the Soviet Army tunic, and as I jumped down into Tim Isaac's tank, I caught the back of it, the fold. I caught the belt and the back of the tunic on the little lock that keeps the turret hatch secure, and it made a little hole. I've actually got it next to me. I could show this on the cam if you think it's worth doing. It made it was only a little hole, but it's just things like that jumping into the tank, and I mean, it's all these.
No wonder they wore overalls.
Details.
Like, at least that sort of streamlines the body. But we're going completely off topic.
But actually, really interesting work. Yeah, we are.
I was going to say we've been streaming for like an hour and a half. I reckon we answer a couple more questions in the chat.
All right.
I don't know if there's any other burning issues we want to talk about, but a couple more questions, I reckon.
Well, we can always do another stream in the future, actually.
Yeah, I mean, either when we get like the manuscripts back all edited into page form, we might have something a little bit more good to show, or when the book is out, we can do another promotional stream.
Yeah,
so let us know if you would like that.
When the book is available, would you say the date for that? For
sorry, it comes out May the 20th, 2021. COVID, obviously restricted. Restricted. You know what I'm trying to say. It's late
so
here.
The price is £40. That's, I mean, that's actually quite a good price considering the book weighs something like 1.3 kilograms. It is a hardback, which is absolutely fantastic for us. We were really excited when we heard that. How many pages now?
496. So it's a big boy.
With lots and lots of pictures, frankly, and obviously I have a slight interest in saying this, but my God, that's value for money.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I will answer, or we'll discuss briefly a couple of the questions I think that were in the chat, because we've got a couple here.
Yeah.
I think we shall answer. So Tank Archives asked. We were talking about the Christie suspension. He said, on a similar note, who do you think did a better job developing the Christie tank concept, the UK or the USSR? It's not strictly about the book, but I think it's an interesting question, even if it is just conjecture from our part, if that's even the right word. Sometimes I wonder if English is my first language. Honestly,
I edited the book, so I have a unique perspective on that.
Poor sod. I think that the UK and the Soviet Union approached it from different angles. So the UK tank production is incredibly clean. If you ask me, I think that British tanks are incredibly well made. And their suspension is very fine in the sense of like good tolerances and like very few defects. But they very quick, they drop the core principle of the Christie tank very early, the track wheel drivability conversion. Obviously, the Soviet Union are deep into the BT series before they sort of realise. Well, that's not charitable. We obviously Zyganov was doing work on.
He's one of the lead engineers,
Yes.
by the way.
Vasily, I think it's Vasily. He's doing work on the BT IS series as early as the BT2, looking at ways of improving the traction, for want of a better word, of the drive wheels, and improving the stability of the swing arms, which were notoriously poor. And I think, you know, it's quite telling that by the time we get to the A20 and the A32, that you know, Koshkin is like, we don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to make a convertible tank. It doesn't make any sense. It compromises too much. And yeah, the British had already kind of done that. So when we talk about T-34s and a Christie suspension, I sort of like to, in my head, I don't really call it a Christie suspension. It's like a Christie light, because true Christie suspension is this convertible drive. Whereas, yeah, British tanks and Soviet tanks, and obviously like later Soviet tanks, ditch it. But if I had to answer in less words, I'd say British interpretations is far cleaner than Soviet ones, and they both ultimately dropped the idea very quickly, other than the vertical springs.
Yeah, good. I'd like to field one from Bihuang92. He says, if you're a developing army, the T-34 isn't a bad tank to start, probably a decent basic tank in the early Cold War. That's a really good point. And actually, this is one of the big things that would be interesting to do with regards to Chinese armor, which is, again, as I say, very understudied topic. A lot of work needs to be done there. The really interesting thing about the T-34-85 in China, the People's Republic of China, I should quickly say, is that it is more or less their most, well, it is the most numerous tank. It replaces all of the Japanese tanks. And actually, in the book, we have a really nice introduction to the Chinese military context, you know, what vehicles they have. We've done some good work, research there. And we say, look, this is what they had, and they replaced all these Japanese tanks with Soviet supplied vehicles. Now, the thing is, everyone knows they'd quickly move on to the Type 59 production, okay, by the end of the decade in the 50s. And this is basically the T-54, right? The trouble is that they can't produce the Type 59 in big numbers. And this is why I say you should read the Engineering Communist China one-man story by Dan Ling and Yu Li Sun, because you'll see from a first-hand perspective, and, you know, we can be cautious with oral sources like that. By the way, oral sources do encompass memoirs. Don't ask me why. You can kind of see this problems in the factory, you know, things like electricity is intermittent. And so, you know, a developing state such as the People's Republic, one that was devastated by, you know, nearly 50 years of constant war, the T-34 is absolutely a good place to start. And it stays in service in China for, well, until the 1990s, actually. They slowly, bit by bit, in different military districts, replace it with newer vehicles like the Type 63 amphibious vehicle, Type 62 light tank, effectively a Type 59 scaled down. Also has an 85mm gun, by the way. And one of the coolest sources that I got reading on Chinese T-34s was CIA reports from aerial surveillance. And they'll say, here are what vehicles are at this little random teeny tiny base in this part of the province, in Hubei province, and, you know, random little places. And I read through quite a lot of these. And you can also read them. They're all available online if you go to the CIA reading room. Really interesting sources. And there are so many T-34s. Now, unfortunately, they don't distinguish between T-34 and Type 58, partly because how on earth could you do that from aerial reconnaissance? If you've seen any pictures from CIA aerial recon, you'll sort of know what I'm talking about when that's a problem. But there are so many in service, even in the 60s, 70s, even in the 80s, and they get interesting roles. Some of them are still frontline tanks, some of them are dug in bunkers, maybe, some of them are training vehicles for militia, which is really interesting. And so, yeah, absolutely, T-34, definitely a good place to start. But I think it very, very quickly becomes outclassed as war changes. War changes in the Cold War. that old adage that war never changes is not true. It definitely does. So it was good for 10 years, and really they needed to replace it, and that's more or less what they did. So yeah,
I think
I guess that can.
Yeah, to add my 2 cents onto that, because that was a really good answer.
Thank you.
I would go for a far more simple answer myself. If I was...
That means it's wrong, by the way.
Sorry?
So that means it's going to be wrong.
If I was like a fledgling army, say...
Right, so you're in charge of Angola. What do you do?
I'd say, right, I'd rather have a load of T-54s and T-55s than T-34s, because it's that much more modern, with that much more of a bigger gun, and you've got far more of them. Now, please let me buy them.
And in many, and they do. Many of these developing states do buy T-54s, T-55s. Even Vietnam, they had a lot of T-34s, but
I think
they very quickly bought lots of T-54, 55.
I just think the T-34, by the end of
Korea,
the 50s,
really.
Or even then, the T-34 is replaced during the war technically by the T-44, which is only a stopgap vehicle, but even then, it's been replaced, and there are better vehicles now knocking about. Yeah, I don't know. I just think that there are better options than a T-34. Now, if you were to come up to me and say, "Hey, Frankie, do you want a T-34?" I'm going to say yes, but that's not because I want to fight in one.
I think we'll take one final question, and then I suppose we'd better sign off, because we've been here quite a while, and I don't know if the rugby's ended or not. From Bass Slots, what was your most unexpected discovery when researching the book? Oh, that's a good question.
That's a really good question.
Do you have one in mind? I'll tell you my favorite detail, and it's not anything too exciting, but it really tells you everything you need to know about early T-34s. In the April report, they say this is the report quite early on into production, and they say, okay, we need all these little design changes based on crew feedback. Can you please implement them? My favorite one has got to be a padded seat for the driver, because Frankie, what did they previously have instead of padded seat?
They had a wooden seat.
They had a wooden seat, ladies and gentlemen. A wooden seat, ladies and gentlemen. That is how ergonomic the T-34 is. It is about as ergonomic as a 6-foot bar stool made of sandpaper.
Unexpected discovery from my perspective. I don't know. Just how many changes there were. That's pretty unexpected, because like you say, people just think of it as the T-34 with maybe 3 sub-variants: the L11 gun, the F-34 gun, the hexagonal turret, the press turret, 85s. And then when you actually look at it, there's so much going on, but you can't just break it down that simply. Perhaps that, according to the photographic record, at least one T-34, like we mentioned earlier, was crewed by a teddy bear. That was pretty shocking.
I like the... Oh, no, I didn't mention it. The Chinese T-34. Chinese T-34.
I did mention it. Whoa. I need to talk about China again.
Get it up on screen. I love China. China.
China.
Pull up the firefighting T-34 real quick. Yeah.
Is that the pink one?
We need to earn the stream, but please pull this up.
Is it the pink one?
It is the pink one. That's not why I like it though. It's firefighting T-34. It's a firefighting T-34 made by retired fire captain Chen Songhe, and he made this based on he saw a wildfire. I know it wasn't a wildfire; it was a truck fire. We talk about this in the book. It's great. And he goes to a local scrapyard and he finds a few T-34s. And this is a great report of journalism done by the Liaoning Evening News. They find some T-34s and he gets permission to test them, and he finds one and it drives okay. And he turns it into a firefighting T-34 he adds a dozer on the front. You can see the main gun's been removed. 2 water hoses are in there. The sides of the tank are cooled by water hoses as well. The tracks are apparently glued together to stop fire damaging it. I mean, that's a great T-34. I mean, yeah, the colour scheme is what it is, but Yeah, that's
Mandela Way,
my
eat your
favourite
heart out, I
T-34.
suppose.
Well, it's a military weapon. It's a military weapon that's been converted to civilian use, and it helps people. I think that's a great vehicle. That's my favourite T-34. So yeah, Chen Songhe, good on you. Good guy.
I think we've done a pretty good job, I think, tonight in selling this, guys.
Yes, so buy the book. £40,
I think
that's not a lot.
I think the main takeaway that you guys should have from this is that we're deeply passionate, deeply passionate.
Do you think they got that?
Well, I think they got that you like Chinese T-34s. I think that one came fast.
Oh, is Kraut Report Marcus Hawk? Because if it is, I mean, he should be really happy with the Chinese section, because I know he's making a really good model of one, scale model of one, which I've helped him, advised him on, I should say. So,
I think if you build models,
scale modelers going to love the book.
Oh, scale modelers will explode. I think rivet counters are going to be like, oh my god.
Can we show one last cool Chinese T-34? Can we? Because it's not in the book, and partly because we don't have.
I think I already know which one you're talking about. I'll get it.
Yeah, you do.
Dread.
Another civilian conversion of the T-34 here from China.
Oh no! I thought you were talking about the flamethrower one. I've already put that up.
No, I don't want that. Who cares about that? That's boring. Let's get the civilian stuff up.
Oh dear! Let me get the other one then.
Weapons? Who cares about weapons? No. Yeah, the look at it. It's been converted. Two of them at least have been converted into commercial bulldozers. It's really interesting stuff. Don't know enough about them, but hey, there you go.
Right, and is that everything?
I think that could, again, no more Chinese T-34. We're done for the night.
When you buy this book, leave a review that specifically says the Chinese tanks, because otherwise I think we all might explode. All right.
Well, like I say, it's a topic that needs a lot more research. What I've given in the book is the best we can do currently. I'd love to see what happens in 10 years' time, but that's in 10 years' time. Cool.
Well, with that all being said, I think it's time to end the stream, don't you?
No, I'd agree. So thanks everyone for coming. It was good to talk about all these things.
I hope that you guys are as excited as I am. Also incredibly nervous, but I'm always nervous about everything. I open my front door when I'm nervous, so I wouldn't be this nervous if I didn't think we were going to make the book was like this good. Genuinely, I think that it's got so much to offer for everyone, and even if you disagree with a lot, if you disagree with the nomenclature, like the pictures alone are a book on itself. We could have just released a book of pictures. And it would lose something, in my opinion, not having the history like we do. But there's just so much on offer, guys. So much on offer, and we've worked so hard for the last 4 years on it, and we just can't wait for you to get your hands on it.
Yeah. So goodbye for now. We'll see you soon.
До свидания, товарищи.